The record was still running when they found it. That was the first thing the archivists noted, not the content, not the timestamp, not even the chamber it had been recovered from. Just that the recording device had never been switched off, as if whoever left it behind hadn't expected anyone to ever come looking, or hadn't cared. The device was human-made, small, dull, scratched along one edge in a pattern that looked almost deliberate. The archivist who first held it, a Velthari senior recorder named Ossian Drell, 14-limbed and older than most star charts in common use, turned it over in two of his handling appendages and felt something he could not immediately categorize. It would take him 3 rotations to identify the sensation. By then, the empire he had served for 400 years no longer existed. He pressed play. The Velthari Consolidated Dominion had never issued a threat it did not intend to keep. This was not arrogance. It was mathematics. In 900 years of expansion across 43 inhabited systems, the Dominion had made exactly 11 ultimatums. Every single one had resulted in compliance. The concept of non-compliance was not something their governance models had needed to seriously compute since the Kethara accession, and that had been over 3 centuries ago. So when Supreme Arbiter Methan Vel rose before the Galactic Council chamber and delivered the Dominion's formal ultimatum to the human delegation, he did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Humanity will cede administrative control of the Kepler corridor, dissolve all independent defense contracts beyond the outer reach boundary, and submit population registration data to Dominion census infrastructure within 72 standard hours. Paused, letting the chamber's acoustics carry the silence. Refusal will be considered an act of hostile sovereignty, and the Dominion will respond accordingly. The human delegate, a woman named Sira Vasquez, compact and dark-eyed with a small scar above her left eyebrow that the Velthari cultural analysts had somehow failed to note in their profile, wrote something on the paper document in front of her. Paper. Actual paper. Several council members exchanged glances. She didn't look up. 10 minutes, she said. Methan Vel's secondary respiratory membranes fluttered. I beg your pardon. Give us 10 minutes. She finally looked up. Her expression was not what he expected. It was not fear. It was not defiance. It was something that translated poorly through the universal interface, something the Velthari linguistic matrix later flagged as closest to resignation that has already been survived once before. Just 10 minutes. Then we'll give you our answer. No species had ever asked for 10 minutes before answering a Dominion ultimatum. The request was so structurally strange that Methan Vel granted it purely because no protocol existed to refuse it. The human delegation stepped outside the chamber. That was Mystery 1. What happened in those 10 minutes? The chamber recordings showed nothing. The corridor sensors showed the humans standing in a loose cluster, speaking in low voices, several of them looking at their feet. One, a younger man, heavyset, with the kind of hands that looked like they had repaired things rather than signed documents, pressed his palm flat against the corridor wall for a long moment as though feeling for something. He closed his eyes. Nobody seemed to be giving orders. Nobody seemed to be in command. When they returned, Vasquez sat down, smoothed her paper document, and said, "No." And that was the second mystery because the word no should have ended everything immediately. But it didn't. Something about the way she said it made Methan Vel hesitate for exactly 4 seconds before responding. 4 seconds. In 900 years of Dominion ultimatums, a supreme arbiter had never hesitated. The chamber recordings caught it. The archivists later spent weeks trying to understand what had happened in that specific 4-second window. What had Methan Vel seen in her face that made him pause? The Dominion fleet was already positioned. 47 capital ships, 216 support vessels, orbiting the edge of the Kepler corridor in a formation so mathematically precise, it was visible to the naked eye from 3 inhabited planets as a moving constellation. The response order took 4 minutes to transmit. The fleet acknowledged. Commanders prepared. And that was Mystery 3, because the fleet, following protocol, first activated long-range sensor sweeps of the corridor itself before beginning approach. Standard procedure. Verify the target's defensive capability. Quantify the response required. Calibrate. The sensor sweep came back. For 11 seconds, the fleet's senior communications officer, a Velthari named Korath Sen, stared at the readout. Then he transmitted the data to Flagship Command without comment because he genuinely did not have words for what he was seeing. The Kepler corridor was empty, not undefended, not lightly defended, empty. Every human installation, every station, every ship registry that Dominion intelligence had catalogued over the previous decade gone, as if they had never been there. Korath Sen's log entry for that moment read, "Sensor malfunction suspected. Running diagnostics." The diagnostics confirmed the sensors were functioning perfectly. The Dominion's first assumption was that humanity had already surrendered. That the emptying of the corridor was a gesture of pre-compliance, a people recognizing the inevitable and quietly removing their assets before the formal process began. This interpretation was logical. It was consistent with every historical precedent in the Dominion's expansion record. It was completely wrong. Korath Sen's fleet entered the corridor on schedule. The empty space was unsettling in a way that fell outside his training vocabulary. Deep space was always empty. This was simply the nature of vacuum, and yet this felt different. Like walking into a room where furniture has been removed too quickly. Like the absence had shape. "All clear on approach vectors," reported his tactical officer, a young Velthari named Thresh Ale on his first major deployment. "No contacts, no debris, no residual energy signatures." "That last part," Korath Sen said slowly. "Repeat that." "No residual energy signatures, Commander." He stared at the display. Human installations ran on fusion-adjacent systems. Even abandoned stations left thermal residue for weeks. Decommissioned ships left particle traces for months. You couldn't just remove energy signatures. The physics didn't permit it. "How long," Korath Sen said, "would it take a human installation to drop below our detection threshold?" Thresh Ale ran the calculation. Looked up. "Minimum 40 days, Commander, if everything was shut down simultaneously." The ultimatum had been delivered 6 hours ago. Korath Sen filed a Priority 1 communication back to the council chamber and said nothing to his crew while he waited for the reply. He stood at the viewport and looked at the empty space where a decade of human infrastructure should have been, and he tried to find an explanation that made physical sense. He couldn't. Back in the council chamber, the communication arrived while Mithon Vel was preparing the formal response declaration. He read it once, read it again. Then, for the first time in his career, he did something that would later be described in Velthari historical records as the moment the calculation changed. He turned to the human delegation table, where Vasquez was quietly writing on her paper document, and he asked, "Where did your infrastructure go?" She looked up, set down her pen, considered him for a moment. "We moved it," she said, "in 6 hours. "We moved it," she said again, not defensively, not proudly, just as a statement of something that had happened. "That is not," he stopped, started again. "The physics of relocation at that scale require." "We know what they require," she said, and for one brief moment something crossed her face that the translation matrix later struggled to categorize. The closest approximation was the particular patience of someone who has done a difficult thing many times and is tired of explaining it. Mithon Vel did not know what to do with that answer. His entire governance model had no protocol for it. He ordered the fleet to hold position and called an emergency session of the Dominion High Council. He didn't realize yet that the 10 minutes were still happening. The emergency session convened with 17 of the Dominion's 22 High Counselors physically present. The others joined via quantum link. Supreme Intelligence Coordinator Feth Urak, considered the sharpest analytical mind in the Dominion, took point. "Explain the detection failure," he said to Korath Sen's holographic projection. "There was no detection failure," Korath Sen said. "The corridor is genuinely empty. No signatures, no debris. No evidence of prior habitation at the level our records documented. Then the records were falsified. Human intelligence manufactured the impression of infrastructure. We've verified those records from 12 independent Dominion sources over 9 years. The infrastructure was real." Feth Urak was quiet for a moment. Then, "They anticipated the ultimatum." By how long? Nobody answered that question. Because the answer, when they eventually reconstructed the timeline, was going to be worse than any of them were prepared for in that room. So the silence stretched out, and into the silence came another priority one: communication. This one from the Dominion's Signals Intelligence Division, a department so rarely activated that several high counselors had to be reminded it existed. The division had been monitoring human communications channels since the ultimatum. Routine intercept protocol. What they expected to find was exactly what every other species produced under existential threat: scrambled command traffic, emergency broadcasts, diplomatic back channels, fear. What they found was nothing. Human communication channels, all of them, civilian and military, had gone quiet. Not jammed, not encrypted. Quiet. Billions of people, across dozens of habitats and stations and vessels, had simply stopped transmitting. The signals analyst who wrote the report prefaced it with a line that would be quoted in Dominion historical texts for as long as there were Dominion historical texts. "We have never observed a communicatively advanced species voluntarily produce silence at this scale. The behavioral literature contains no framework for this." Feth Urak read it twice, looked across the table at his colleagues. What are they doing? No one knew. This was the moment right here between the silence and the empty corridor when the Dominion made its most consequential error, not the ultimatum itself. The error was in the interpretation of what the silence meant. The Dominion's behavioral models were built on a core assumption that all communicatively advanced species process existential threat the same way: mobilization, communication, visible reaction. The instinct to coordinate out loud, to be seen coordinating, because visibility signals strength and strength deters attack. What the models could not account for was a species that had spent enough of its history being the smaller party that it had learned to go quiet when threatened. Not out of submission, out of something considerably more dangerous. Feth Urak's council concluded, after 6 hours of analysis, that the silence was a sign of chaos. That the humans were panicking, and the communications blackout reflected system collapse, leadership breakdown, population paralysis, the beginning of a species recognizing it had no viable path forward. They began preparing the terms of occupation. They were, in the language of the species they were analyzing, making exactly the mistake the humans were counting on. Vasquez was in a small antechamber off the council hall when the young man with the mechanic's hands found her. His name was Darrow Kishin, officially listed as a secondary technical advisor to the delegation. What he actually was had not been included in any document provided to Dominion intelligence. He sat across from her at the narrow table and put a small device between them, not the recording device the archivists would later find. A different one, a receiver. "It's running," he said. She nodded. "You know they're going to hit the stations," he said. Not a question. "They're going to hit where they think the stations are," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "How many people know the real coordinates?" "Enough, Sierra," he leaned forward. "How many people in the corridor don't know the stations moved? How many are still in the old positions because we couldn't get them all out?" The pause before she answered was very short, but it was there. "Some," she said. Darrow Kishin looked at the table. Pressed his palms flat against it the same way he had pressed them against the corridor wall during the 10 minutes, that same gesture, like he was grounding himself through the material. "How many is some? Darrow, how many?" "Enough that it matters," she said quietly. "Not enough that it stops anything." He sat with that for a long time. In the chamber down the hall, the Velthari High Council was drawing up occupation terms. Outside the station, 47 capital ships were repositioning toward coordinates that were mostly empty space now, mostly, not entirely, and somewhere in the silence that billions of humans had decided to become, something enormous was moving. "They're going to think they won," Darrow said finally. "Yes." "For how long?" Vasquez picked up her pen, looked at her paper. "Long enough." He didn't ask long enough for what. He already knew. The Dominion fleet fired on the Kepler corridor coordinates at the 72-hour mark, exactly as protocol required. The bombardment lasted 4 hours. When the thermal dissipation cleared, long-range scans confirmed significant material destruction, debris fields consistent with structural collapse, heat signatures matching catastrophic decompression. The fleet reported a successful suppression action. Methon Vel accepted the report, issued a statement to the Galactic Council, declared humanity's independent defense infrastructure neutralized, moved forward with occupation phase planning, and for approximately 11 hours the Dominion believed it had won. Here is what they did not know. Here is what changes every single thing that came before it. The Kepler Corridor operation had not been planned in response to the ultimatum. It had been planned 7 years earlier, not as a contingency, not as a defensive scenario someone had filed away hopefully. As an operation with assigned personnel, pre-positioned resources, rehearsed movements, and a trigger condition that had always read, when not if. The silence wasn't panic. It was a species that had grown up on a planet where the most dangerous predators learned very early that you didn't announce yourself before you acted. A behavioral inheritance so deep that it had survived 40,000 years of civilization and still lived in the marrow of how humans moved when they felt genuinely threatened. The empty corridor wasn't a retreat. It was the first move. The debris the Dominion's fleet detected wasn't wreckage from their bombardment. The forensic analysis, conducted much later by a Velthari team that approached the data with the specific kind of dread of people who already suspect what they're going to find, determined that the debris had been placed there before the fleet arrived. Pre-positioned material, designed to read exactly like the aftermath of a successful bombardment. Designed to make the Dominion believe it had hit something real. Designed to give humanity 11 hours. 11 hours during which the Dominion was writing occupation protocols instead of tracking where 11 human deep field vessels had gone. 11 hours during which nobody in the Dominion Signals Division was looking for a different kind of communication, not broadcast, not transmitted, but physical. Couriers. Moving bodies carrying information through relay points that had never appeared on any Dominion surveillance map, because they were built inside infrastructure that Dominion observers had classified as civilian and non-military. The behavioral literature, as the signals analyst had noted, contained no framework for this. Feth Urak was the one who figured it out. He was reviewing the debris analysis, sitting in his quarters at an hour that didn't map neatly to any species' sleep cycle, running numbers that didn't add up when the calculation turned over in his mind and he saw it whole, not piece by piece, all at once. He sat very still for a long moment. Then he opened a communication channel to Methon Vel. "The bombardment hit a decoy," he said without preamble. A pause. "That is not. The debris composition doesn't match our records of their installation materials. It matches nothing in their documented construction catalog. Someone made debris that looked right but isn't." His voice was very controlled. "We have been given 11 hours to believe we succeeded. We need to know what has happened in those 11 hours. Methon Vel was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, "Get me the fleet." The fleet was already reporting something strange. Korath Sen had been uneasy since the bombardment, not for any reason he could articulate, but the feeling that had settled in the corridor on first arrival had never fully left, and now it had sharpened into something almost physical. "Commander," Thresh Ale at his station, voice careful, "I'm picking up something." "On the long range." "No, sir, close range." A pause. "Very close range." It was not a weapon's signature. The fleet's defensive systems didn't flag it because it wasn't consistent with any known weapons profile. It was a gravity anomaly, a subtle, specific distortion that Velthari sensor architecture had never needed to filter for, because no species in the Dominion's experience used gravity as a navigational manipulation tool. Humans had for 60 years. It was so thoroughly embedded in their deep space transit methodology that their engineers had stopped thinking of it as a technology and started thinking of it as just how you moved. It didn't appear in any intelligence file because the Dominion had never asked the right question to find it. By the time Thresh Ale understood what the anomaly meant, the 11 hours were over. 43 human vessels came out of what the Velthari tactical team would later describe, in a report that circulated through the Dominion's command structure with the particular velocity of information that terrifies people, as a region of space we had certified as empty. Not from behind. not from above or below the fleet's defensive plane. They came from inside the fleet's own perimeter. The gravity transit methodology allowed for something that Velthari physics models had historically classified as a theoretical impossibility: micro-displacement, moving a vessel through a point in space that occupied the same coordinate field as another vessel without triggering proximity collision systems, because the displacement lasted for only 0.3 seconds and then resolved to a clean exit position. Human engineers had discovered this capability by accident, had spent 12 years making it reliable, had decided not to publish the research anywhere Dominion signals intelligence might intercept it. The 43 vessels did not fire weapons. This was the fourth misinterpretation, and it was the most important one. Korath Sen, watching them materialize inside his fleet perimeter, assumed for approximately 8 seconds that they were going to open fire, and his defensive response protocols activated accordingly, which meant 47 capital ships and 216 support vessels began emergency maneuvers that, in the confined geometry of a fleet caught in close quarters, immediately created massive navigational interference. 3 Dominion ships collided, not because of human weapons, because of the emergency maneuver protocols activating simultaneously in a space not designed for that kind of mass movement. The humans were transmitting. Korath Sen could see the transmission indicator. They were broadcasting on an open channel to his fleet, to the Council chamber, to the Dominion's command network, to every Galactic Council monitoring station within relay range. He opened the channel. Vasquez's voice, calm, like someone who had been through something difficult before and knew what the other side felt like. "We want to speak to the Supreme Arbiter." Methan Vel took the call in the Council chamber, because the chamber was where he was when it came through, and because some instinct told him that the location mattered, that this conversation needed witnesses. He wasn't wrong. "Your fleet is currently in a navigational emergency that will resolve itself in approximately 9 minutes without further casualties, if no additional evasive actions are ordered," Vasquez said. Her voice through the transmission was slightly compressed but clear. "We would suggest communicating that to your commanders." Methan Vel passed the instruction without taking his eyes off the transmission screen. His hands, he realized distantly, had assumed the Velthari equivalent of the posture a species takes when it understands for the first time that it does not have complete information about something important. "What do you want?" he said. "The same thing we wanted before." A brief pause. "Nothing new. We want you to rescind the ultimatum. We want the fleet withdrawn from the corridor. We want no further administrative claims against human-governed space. You are 43 vessels against a fleet that, we're not here to fight your fleet, Arbiter." Something in her voice shifted, not to threat exactly, to something harder to name. "We've been inside your fleet's perimeter for 11 hours. We weren't here to fight. We were here to count." He did not immediately understand what that meant. Darrow Kishan's voice came through the channel from somewhere in the background. "Tell him what we counted, Sira." And she said, "We know the name and position of every ship in the Dominion's strategic reserve fleet. The one that isn't in the corridor. The one you didn't move to apply the ultimatum because you didn't think you'd need it." A pause. "We know it because 3 of our vessels have been inside its perimeter for the same 11 hours. They'd like to say hello." The strategic reserve fleet was 2 systems away. It was the Dominion's most classified military asset. Its position was not in any document accessible to non-Dominion parties. Its existence was known to fewer than 200 individuals in the entire Dominion governance structure. A new transmission channel opened on Methan Vel's screen. A second set of 47 human vessels, deep in the heart of a fleet that was supposed to be invisible, broadcasting on the same open frequency. The Council chamber was completely silent. "We are not going to destroy your fleet," Vasquez said. "We are not going to destroy anything. That is not what this is. What this is," and here her voice did something that the translation matrix processed as grief wearing the functional clothing of resolve, "is us telling you that we know where you are, all of you, everywhere." Another pause. "And we need you to understand that before you make another decision about us." The Dominion High Council deliberated for 3 hours. The word deliberate understates the process. The room contained some of the finest analytical minds the Velthari had produced in 4 centuries, and every one of them arrived at the same conclusion within the first 40 minutes, and then spent the remaining 2 hours and 20 minutes trying to find a flaw in it. There was no flaw. Feth Yurak was the one who finally said it out loud. They built this in response to a threat that hadn't happened yet. They planned it before we issued the ultimatum. Which means they expected the ultimatum, said Counselor Murthal. They prepared for the ultimatum. There is a difference. Feth Yurak pressed his handling appendages together in the gesture that in Velthari body language indicated the processing of something that violated fundamental assumptions. The question is, how far back does the preparation go? Nobody wanted to answer that question. Because if the infrastructure had been moved before the ultimatum, and the decoy debris had been pre-positioned before the ultimatum, and the vessels had been placed inside both fleets before the ultimatum, then the humans had done all of this before they even knew an ultimatum was coming, which meant either their intelligence was extraordinarily better than the Dominion's, or they knew it was coming, said Murthal quietly, because they understood how we think better than we understand how they think. The silence in that room was different from the silence the Dominion had observed in human communication channels. The Velthari silence was the silence of 900 years of confident expansion, running into a wall it had never expected to find. There is another possibility, said Feth Yurak, and his voice had taken on a quality his colleagues had never heard from him before, something that a human might have recognized as the particular care of someone who is about to say something that cannot be unsaid. We are assuming this is the extent of their preparation. We are assuming that what we have found is the whole of what they built. Methan Vel looked at him. What we actually know, Feth Yurak continued, is that they built what we found. We do not know what else they built that we have not found. We do not know what we are not currently looking at. Korath Sen, standing at the viewport of his flagship while his crew worked through the navigational recovery, asked Thresh Ale a question that had nothing to do with his current duties. The gravity transit method. How long did it take them to develop it? Thresh Ale looked up from his station. Sir, the technology they used to enter our perimeter. How long would a development cycle like that take? Thresh Ale ran the calculation with the careful precision of someone who suspects the answer will be disturbing. Given their documented propulsion base, minimum 30 years, more likely 45 to 60. Korath Sen nodded slowly, said nothing. Looked out at the space where 43 human vessels sat with absolute stillness, not threatening, not retreating, simply there, present in the way that something becomes present when it has decided to stop pretending to be elsewhere. Thresh Ale, he said, Commander, they've been building toward this for 60 years. It appears so, sir. Before we issued the ultimatum, he let that settle. Before the last 3 arbiters issued anything. Before we had any formal diplomatic structure with them at all. He turned from the viewport. His face carried an expression that Thresh Ale had no word for, though he would spend time later trying to find one. What were they building towards 60 years before they had a reason to? Thresh Ale didn't answer. There was no good answer. The honest answer was that they hadn't been building toward anything specific. They had simply been building, the way a species builds when it has learned that the universe is large and often hostile, and the only variable within your control is how ready you are when the moment arrives. The way a species builds when readiness is not a response to threat, but a permanent condition of existence. The Velthari had no cultural framework for that. 900 years of being the largest thing in the room had made it impossible to imagine inhabiting the psychology of something that had never had that luxury. Korath Sen filed his report, recommended withdrawal, added 3 paragraphs that his superior initially flagged as exceeding the scope of a tactical report before reading them twice and forwarding them up the chain without alteration. The last paragraph read, I want to note for the record that at no point did the human vessels adopt an aggressive posture. They had full positional advantage for 11 hours and did not use it offensively. I do not know what to do with this. I am including it because I believe it is the most important thing I observed today, and I cannot explain why. The council chamber smelled different when Vasquez returned. Mithanvel had been actually standing, which was unusual for extended sessions, and he sat when she entered, which was also unusual, and she filed both observations in the back of her mind for later. Darrow-Kishan stayed near the door. The recording device, the small one, scratched along one edge, was running in his jacket pocket. "The Dominion is prepared to discuss terms," Mithanvel said. Vasquez sat down, did not reach for her paper. This also was noted by everyone watching. Of what? A pause that cost him something. The withdrawal of the ultimatum, the return of the fleet to Dominion space. A mutual, you want to call it a negotiation, she said, not accusatory, observational, he considered. Yes, arbiter, she folded her hands on the table. We don't want to negotiate, we don't want terms, we want the same thing we said at the beginning. She held his gaze. We just needed you to know first that we were serious. Something shifted in the chamber. Several council members moved, or stopped moving, in ways that communicated what words weren't being said. You understand what you're asking us to rescind, Mithanvel said carefully. 900 years of expansion policy. I understand exactly what I'm asking. Her voice was quiet now. Quiet in the way that something gets quiet when it has survived long enough to stop needing to be loud. And I understand that it's harder to be asked to stop than to be forced to stop. I know what this costs you, a pause, but I need you to understand what continuing would cost, not what we would do to you, what you would have to do to us to actually stop us, and what that would cost, in time, in resources, in the kind of damage that doesn't look like damage until it's finished. Mithanvel was quiet. We're not the strongest species in this room, Vasquez said. We know that. We have always known that. Something crossed her face, the same expression she'd worn when she said we moved it, the patience of someone who had done a difficult thing before. But we are the species that planned for this conversation 60 years before we knew we'd need it, and we will plan for the next one before it arrives, and the one after that. She looked at him steadily. We do not know how to stop doing that. It is not something we are capable of choosing. The chamber was silent. Darrow-Kishan, near the door, pressed his palm flat against the wall. The Dominion rescinded the ultimatum 14 hours later. The formal record listed the reason as diplomatic resolution following mutual strategic reassessment. The actual reason, the one Feth Urek put in his private analysis, the one that circulated through the Dominion's command structure in the years following with the careful, constrained movement of something people want to discuss, but aren't sure how, was simpler and considerably harder to process. The Dominion had encountered, for the first time in 900 years, a species that could not be calculated. Not because humans were irrational, the opposite. They were relentlessly rational in pursuit of something the Dominion's models kept failing to identify as a goal. They planned across timescales that exceeded political administrations, maintained readiness through generations that never expected to use what they were building, went silent when logic said they should communicate, moved when logic said they should hold, and held when logic said they should flee. Every model the Dominion applied to them produced wrong predictions, not occasionally, consistently. The specific flavor of being wrong was always the same. The Dominion concluded that humans were reacting, and then discovered that what looked like reaction had been preparation that predated the stimulus. Feth Urek's private analysis concluded with a line that was quoted, quietly, in non-official contexts, for longer than the Dominion itself survived. The fundamental error was assuming that they were responding to us. In every encounter we have now reviewed, they were not responding to us. They were already in progress. We were the ones responding to them. We simply did not know it. The recording device Ossian Drell found in the aftermath in the small antechamber off the council hall on the narrow table still running contained 43 hours of audio. Most of it was ambient sound. An empty room. The subtle acoustic signature of a space recently occupied. Near the end there were 11 minutes of two voices. A man and a woman speaking quietly. Most of it was not about politics or strategy or the survival of a species. It was about a city, a specific city, on a specific planet, with a specific quality of light in the early morning that the man described in language that the translation matrix flagged as non-functional, because it did not correspond to any information transfer purpose the matrix could identify. It was the kind of language humans apparently used to talk about things they wanted to return to. Near the very end, the woman said, "We should go." And the man said, "In a minute." And there was a long silence, and then the sound of two people leaving a room, and then 40 more minutes of the acoustic signature of emptiness, the device faithfully recording air and distance, and the faint mechanical breath of a ventilation system built by a species that had never expected to be significant. Ossian Drell listened to all 43 hours. He set the device down on his work table when it finished, and sat for a very long time in the particular silence of someone who has understood something they cannot understand. He was the finest archivist in the Dominion's history. He had recorded 900 years of expansion, every ultimatum and conquest and capitulation, every moment where the Dominion had encountered something, and absorbed it or moved through it or left it behind. He had never recorded an ending. He picked up his own recording instrument, the standard Velthari archival format, crystalline, cold, precise, and began. Note for the central record. I have reviewed the Kepler corridor incident in full. My assessment is as follows. The Velthari Consolidated Dominion did not lose because humanity was stronger. We did not lose because they were more advanced. We did not lose because fortune was against us or because we made an error in execution. He paused. Outside his window, the space that had held an empire was already becoming something else, as space always does. We lost because they were already finished with this war before we declared it. They had been finished with it for 60 years. The entire encounter, the ultimatum, the fleet response, the council session, all of it was not a crisis for them. It was an appointment they had kept precisely on schedule. I do not know how to record a species like that. I do not have the correct form. What I know is this: somewhere right now, while we are learning the shape of what happened here, they are already planning for whatever comes next. They are doing this not because they are cruel or because they want to fight, but because they are a species that learned very early on a world that gave them no reason to feel safe, that the only thing standing between the present and a future you can live in is the work you did before the future arrived. They have never stopped doing that work. They will never stop. Made the mistake of thinking the corridor was their line. It was not their line. It was a door. And when we pushed it, we found out that behind the door was not a room. It was a hallway. And the hallway goes much further than we were prepared to walk. He set the recorder down, looked out at the dark. Somewhere in a city with a specific quality of morning light that two people had spoken about quietly in an empty room while an empire was deciding whether to end them, someone was already at work. Not in response to anything, not because a threat had arrived, simply because the work was what you did, because the next moment was always coming whether you were ready or not, and humans, by the particular and irreversible architecture of what they were, had decided, somewhere back in the unreachable depths of their history, that not ready was the one condition they were not willing to accept. The archive light blinked, waiting for him to continue. He did not continue. There was nothing left that needed to be said. The record was still running.